Good morning. Everyone, welcome to the Energy, Environment, and Telecommunications Committee. And today is February 7th. We've got a good agenda today, 3 bills to hear and a work session. We're going to start with our work session. Toni Heller. Toni, come on up forward if you would. And Toni is coming today from Boulder, Colorado. I'm glad the weather didn't prevent any of your travels.
Yeah, thank you.
So we're looking forward to hearing your views on climate science data. Yes. Senator Carlisle.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Appreciate the opportunity to make just a brief opening remark. I just want to say I'm sorry our good chair is unable to join us today.
I might interrupt, though. I believe that Senator Erickson's going to join us by phone, and I see Ben over there trying to contact him, so he may be available here just a second. If you want to wait just a minute, we'll see. I think Tony's getting set up anyway, so. Our chair is in Washington, D.C., so I think we can patch him through here just a sec. If we're the telecommunication committee, we ought to be able to,
That's right.
to get a hold of him.
That's right.
Thank you. Okay, I think it's working. Senator Erickson, are you on the phone? Can you hear us?
Yep.
Great.
Senator Erickson, can you hear me there, Senator Sheldon?
Very well. Like we said, we're the Telecommunications Committee. We ought to be able to make this work. So, okay, Mr. Heller's here. He's just about to begin, and Senator Carlisle would like to make a comment.
Thank you.
I'd like to make a comment first, if you wouldn't mind, Mr. Chairman.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to welcome our guests to the committee today. And on the overhead, you'll see 2 headlines from the Washington Times newspaper. The first headline talks about a whistleblower who is bringing forth some information with regards to climate data that was brought by the federal government with regards to what happened before the Paris Agreement and some of the data with regards to climate change. And the second headline you can see highlights the fact that the federal government is going to be going back and reviewing the science that they use, the data, and the methodology they use to get to those conclusions leading up to Paris. So I think our guest today is extremely timely to have him here today to provide some insights and perhaps a different opinion than we're used to hearing in Washington State about the particular issue. So I think it's great to have him here today. I think it's important that as we move forward in the state, we allow more people to the table, not fewer people, and we allow more views to be heard, not fewer views. And that's why I really welcome the opportunity for this hearing today. And I thank you again, Senator Sheldon, for agreeing to chair the committee today and for this very interesting presentation I'm sure we're going to have.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, Senator Carlisle.
Thank you so much. And I appreciate the good chairman's belief that this is an important effort to hear divergent views. Welcome, Mr. Heller, of course. And I just want to say straight up that I think it is important to put on the table the fact that we are having what can only be described as a relatively uncomfortable, awkward, and embarrassing presentation questioning the core science of NASA, NOAA, and other data is a disappointment. The fact of the matter is what we're not doing in this committee is passing important legislation regarding the cleanup of Puget Sound, regarding the water needs of Yakima Valley, regarding the policies and the programs of public safety at the local level relative to protection of our water and so many other areas. And I appreciate Mr. Heller has a different viewpoint. He's been very busy in the 24 hours that you've been in town tweeting, and one of them was, I believe 97% of global warming is indeed man-made, but fraudsters at NASA and NOAA who tamper with data. And I just think that that's an unfortunate prioritization by the majority of this committee and by our chair. And I would ask him to reconsider the work plan for the session, given that we have the inability now to hear all of our bills that are referred to this committee over the course of this session. We're 2/3 of the way through. We've only executed a few small bills. We haven't heard hardly any compared to what we should, and we're not going to get through the work of this session. It's a profound disappointment that this is the priority in this day and age, to have what could only be described as barely a 1950s era presentation around questioning climate.
Well, thanks.
Appreciate that.
Thanks, Senator Carlisle. And we're just going to move ahead. And I notice your bill is first on our list here as soon as the presentation is over. So we're going to continue to work through all the bills, and I think we'll give them hopefully give them hearings and have some consideration at the end of our first cutoff here. So thank you. Yes, Mr. Heller.
Good, thank you.
We're gonna try to allocate 40 minutes for you, and then have some questions. So
okay,
go right ahead.
Can you hear me? Okay, yeah, Senator Carlisle, I completely agree with you. I've been a very active environmentalist all my life. I worked very hard for the Clean Air and Water Act back in the 1970s. I actually testified at my first congressional hearing 45 years ago in support of wilderness area in Utah. Made me very unpopular with people in Utah. I worked for I volunteered for several summers as a wilderness ranger at the Cibola and Santa Fe National Forest in New Mexico. I'm a very big advocate. I'm a full-time cyclist. I'm a very big advocate of mass transit. I hate driving. I would love to see 80% of the cars off the road. So I completely agree with you that about environmental priorities. I'm definitely no friend of oil companies because I would like to see the cars off the road. I've been hit by cars on my bicycle several times, and I would love to see changes in how we do things. So that's not what this is about. I'm a scientist. I'm an engineer. I'm concerned about the integrity of science. I've been studying this very hard for the past 10 years, and what I've discovered is very alarming. And as Senator Erickson pointed out, it's very timely that this information came out about NOAA, and I'm going to be presenting a lot more in-depth information about it. So I hope you'll hear me out and keep an open mind about what I'm saying. And I think you'll find out that what I'm saying is definitely not 1950s science. It's very much what's going on today. So this graph I've got displayed up here is the current NASA temperature graph. We're used to seeing the graphs like this a lot, where they show steady warming from about 1880 to the present. These graphs are generated by very small groups of people within NASA and NOAA, but thousands of scientists and policymakers like yourself depend on the accuracy of this data. So it's very important that the data is correct, and it's very important that it's analyzed independently and verified independently, and that's what I've been doing. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my background now. I've been working on mission-critical projects in science and engineering for about 40 years, things where people's lives and companies' lives depend on things being perfect. Very little room for error. I have degrees in science and engineering. I've spent 20 years doing microprocessor design at companies like Intel, Motorola, ST Microelectronics, IBM. I once was offered a job at the DuPont Design Center here near Olympia, and that was the only other time I've ever been to Olympia, and there was about a foot of snow that time, so it seems to happen every time I come out here. My job as a microprocessor designer was verification, and verification is very important to these companies. One small error in a massive database can cause a product to fail, can cost the company billions of dollars, can even cause the company itself to fail. So they take it very seriously. And my expertise was verification, was fleshing out all of the errors in the design. I was very good at this. I fleshed out thousands of design bugs during my career. There was never a significant bug in any part of design I worked on. And the way I accomplished this was taking a very adversarial role. I assumed that everybody else's work was incorrect until proven otherwise. And that's exactly the same approach which I've taken with the climate data. I've probably worked on the design team of the microprocessor that's in your computer. This is not 1950s technology. This is 2017 technology that I work on. I've had the opportunity to work on quite a few other very interesting products. I've done a number of software development projects for climate and weather models at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. I've done some extremely good work for them that's well known. I was a research scientist for many years at Los Alamos and Sandia National Labs. I did geothermal energy research at Los Alamos. I worked on Jimmy Carter's oil shale project. I worked on Al Gore's Key Escrow project in the mid-90s. I did the safety analysis report for DOE's nuclear waste disposal site in southern New Mexico. Once again, this is a life or death kind of thing. You can't make mistakes with that. I've done imaging systems for Defense Department drones where soldiers' lives depend on it. There's no room for error. Recently I've done engineering on Google's virtual reality system, and I've done engineering of remote surgical equipment. Once again, life or death. It has to be right. This is the way I've analyzed the data. I expect perfection. Okay, this is an award I was given by IBM, Motorola, and Apple on a processor design I did a while back. PowerPC 604 RISC microprocessor made functional by Toni Heller. I'm a bulldog about doing things the right way. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, I'm a lifelong environmentalist. I can take the environment very seriously, protecting the environment very seriously. I see that global warming has become a distraction which has derailed the environmental movement, and that's one of my big concerns. And I was a true believer in global warming for decades before I came around to this realization. I don't have any ties to any energy company. I don't take any funding other than small donations on my blog. I am not what people would consider a big oil stooge. In fact, like I said, I would like to see 80% of the cars off the road. Okay, here's some of my favorite quotes which guide me. In questions of science, the authority of 1,000 is not worth the humble reasoning of a single individual, from Galileo. Dr. Richard Feynman, probably the greatest American scientist, said, "You should in science believe logic and arguments carefully drawn and not authorities." Michael Crichton said, "Historically, the claim of consensus has been the first refuge of scoundrels. It's a way to avoid debate." And I thank you very much, Senator Erickson, for bringing me here and allowing me to open up this debate. Okay, once again, here is the graph from NASA showing steady warming since 1880. And we just assume this is correct, right? NASA are the people who went to the moon. They must know what they're doing. But this NASA graphs looks very different from past government temperature graphs. In 1974, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, which is the U.S. government's national climate laboratory in Boulder, Colorado, where I live, and I've done some work for them, they showed no warming from 1870 to 1970. In fact, they show a little bit of cooling. There was a very large warming spike from 1880 to 1940, and then essentially all of that warming was lost between 1940 and 1970. In 1975, the National Academy of Sciences produced a graph which showed almost exactly the same thing. No warming from 1880 to 1970, a big warming spike around 1940, and then a lot of cooling after 1940, where essentially all of the prior warming was lost. In 1976, National Geographic showed the same thing. They showed no warming from 1880 to 1970, big warming spike around 1940, followed by a lot of global cooling. This is very different from the current NASA temperature graph. So who's right? NASA is showing something very different from prior work done by scientists. So a good way to examine this is by looking at other things that were going on in the world, like the behavior of ice. So by 1932, the Ross Ice Shelf in Antarctica had retreated 30 miles. It was retreating about 10 feet per day. European glaciers were shrinking. The 1930s was the Dust Bowl in the U.S. Millions of people had to leave the Midwest because of heat and drought. It was unbearably hot in the Midwest, and many people moved out to California and the West Coast. So it makes sense that the ice was melting very quickly back then. By 1952, the glaciers of Norway and Alaska had lost half of their mass. It was very hot in the first half of the century. Dr. William Carlson was the leading American expert on glaciers and Arctic ice at the time. He was president of 4 universities during his career, including the University of Vermont. He said, rapid melting threatened to swamp seaports. It was very warm. There was a lot of warming in the first half of the 20th century. In 1947, Dr. Hans Alman, the leading glaciologist in Sweden, reported 10 degrees of Arctic warming, Greenland glaciers melting catastrophically. People living in lowlands along the shore would be inundated. It was very warm then. Ice was melting. Okay, now here's, so in 1923, Professor Waterman of Northwestern University said that Glacier National Park was melting very quickly, and he predicted that the park would be ice-free by the year 1950. But then, in 1955, this is from the New York Times, glaciers in the Pacific Northwest and the Olympic and Cascade Mountains were advancing for the first time in 100 years. So this prior warmth, which had occurred in the first half of the 20th century, had changed to cooling. Glaciers were now growing, which had been retreating previously. Same thing in Greenland and Norway. In 1939, Norwegian glaciers were facing catastrophic collapse, but by 1963, Norwegian glaciers were growing for the first time in 200 years. So clearly, it cooled from 1939 to 1963. The Earth cooled down a lot. And this makes sense in the context of the 1975 National Academy of Sciences graph. They showed it warm when glaciers were melting in 1923 and cold when glaciers were growing in 1963. And that graph made sense. It does not make sense in the context of the current NASA graph, which shows glaciers melting in 1923 when it was cold and glaciers growing in 1963 when it's warm. This is a problem. Okay, by 1961, the New York Times reported a unanimous agreement among scientists that Earth is getting colder. This is not shown in the NASA temperature graph. They have erased a unanimous consensus. There was not unanimous agreement about what would happen in the future, but no, there was no disagreement that Earth was getting colder at that time. By 1970, the New York Times reported that the U.S. and Russia were worried about a colder Arctic, ominously thickening Arctic ice, and a new ice age. Clearly, temperatures were very cold in the 1970s. In 1974, the CIA issued a report saying there was a growing global cooling consensus among climatologists, and it threatened the world's balance of power. They blamed everything that gets blamed on global warming now was blamed on global cooling. Back then they blamed droughts, they blamed floods, they blamed storms, they blamed the polar vortex on global cooling. In 1974, the New York Times reported the mean temperature of the northern hemisphere increased steadily through the 1940s. Since then it's been downwards towards the colder circumstances of the last century. The cooling was real. In 1974, NASA's top climatologist, Stephen Schneider, was frustrated that the Nixon White House wouldn't listen to his warnings about global cooling. I suspect that Nixon probably had more important things to worry about in 1974 than climatologists talking to him about an ice age. In 1974, the National Academy of Sciences wanted to evacuate parts of Africa to save them from drought caused by global cooling. In 1977, NOAA's top climatologist, J.K. Angel, reported 0.5°C global cooling since 1958. This was both on surface temperatures and in measurements he'd taken with weather balloons. Once again, this cooling is not present in the current NASA temperature graphs. In 1978, New York Times reported an international team of specialists finds no end in sight to the 30-year cooling trend. In 1979, NOAA said global cooling since World War II was indisputable. In 1971, NASA's top climatologist, Rasool, predicted a new ice age in 50 years, which would be the year 2021. 3 years from now, 4 years from now. The press and science literature was covered with warnings about new ice age in the 1970s. I've got a few of them here. Science and Mechanics. And the middle one is Science News had a big issue. They had a domed city to protect from the new ice age. New York Times was worried about a new ice age in 1969. 46 scientists from the National Science Foundation gathered at Brown University to discuss the end of the present interglacial, and they agreed that there's evidence of an ominous worldwide cooling trend of temperatures for the past 2 decades. Time magazine did a story about another ice age in 1974. They blamed everything that currently gets blamed on global warming, they blamed it on global cooling in that article. The Canberra Times had an article from Ice Age Cometh based on work that was in the BBC and The Guardian. The Britain's top climate expert, Hubert Lamb, predicts that we are in definite downhill course for temperature for the next 2 centuries, and we're headed into a new ice age. Okay, so now getting into a little bit more of the detail about when we talk about as far as current stuff. In 1989, the head of NOAA's National Climatic Data Center said that Earth had cooled from 1921 to 1979. And he is the scientist who's embroiled in this new controversy about destruction of data, which Senator Erickson was mentioning at the start of this. Okay, so he said the Earth cooled from 1921 to 1979. But NASA's current graph now shows 0.6 C warming from 1921 to 1979. Okay, so I've been working with NOAA to try to get this data set. I've been trying to get it from the archivist for the past 6 months. They've been unable to locate it, which is interesting because Tom Carl was accused by one of NCDC's 2 principal scientists this week of destroying data. Okay, so the NASA temperature graphs clearly do not match the historical evidence record. I think I've provided quite a bit of evidence for that. So what's wrong? Okay, so NASA used to show the 1940 to 1970s cooling. In 1981, the black line is from NASA's James Hansen, their #1 climate alarmist. He did show the cooling in 1981. Current NASA graphs do not show it anymore. They've cooled the past quite a bit and removed the 1940s spike. And ClimateGate emails show us that this was done deliberately. Climate scientists discussed with each other they wanted to get rid of the 1940s blip. They didn't know why. They didn't have any justification for doing it. They just wanted to get rid of it because it was inconvenient for them. Okay, so these next 3 graphs I'm going to flip through are straight off of Gavin Schmidt's website at NASA. He's their director of temperature records. In 2000, NASA showed a total of 0.5 C global warming. By 2012, they had increased that to 0.9 C. By the current time, they now show about 1.4 C warming. So they've nearly tripled the amount of warming they show since the year 2000. Okay, so perhaps what happened was maybe it just warmed a lot since the year 2000. With satellites, there's 2 sets of satellite temperature data. One's from the University of Alabama at Huntsville, the other one's from Remote Sensing Systems. Both of them show little or no warming on Earth since the year 2000, whereas the NASA data in green shows a tremendous amount of warming during that period. And not only that, they show more and more warming every month. Just between November and December, they substantially increased the amount of warming shown in their graphs. So something is clearly amiss here. And these graphs sort of detail the divergence between satellite temperatures and surface temperatures from NASA. On the left, the blue line is satellite temperatures. It shows that there's been little or no warming for the past 25 years. There's a few perturbations around 1992. Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines erupted. It darkened the skies, cooled Earth for a few years, caused a dip. There's been several El Nino warming spikes, including one this past year, which warmed temperature up quite a bit, and then they plummeted back again. But you can see the temperatures are about the same now as they were in 1991. whereas NASA's temperature on the right, the red line, shows about 0.5 C warming during that same period. So the surface temperatures do not agree with satellite data. In 1995, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report showed no tropospheric warming from 1958 to 1993. This was measured both with weather balloons and with satellites. This is in sharp disagreement with what the NASA temperature graph currently shows. Okay, so what is going on with the NASA data? In this graph, in the blue line shows the 2001 version of their graph, and the red line shows their current version of their graph. They're both at the same scale on both axes, but I've normalized them so that they both line up at the same temperatures in the 1880s. You can see they've increased warming tremendously from their prior versions of their graph. Okay, so one of the common claims that comes out of NASA and you hear in the press, which is grossly incorrect, is Gavin Schmidt keeps saying that there's multiple different data sets who are independent of each other. This was an article that was in the E&E News just this week where he said that the work that NOAA is under fire for right now has been replicated by many other scientific institutions. This is not true. The same Gavin Schmidt sent a letter to Australian Senator Malcolm Roberts a couple months ago where Senator Roberts was questioning about some highly altered temperature graphs. And Gavin Schmidt stated unequivocally that the source of the data was NOAA and the source of the adjustments was NOAA. So when it's convenient, they say that the data sets are independent. When it's inconvenient, they say no, it all comes from NOAA. Ross McKittrick from the University of Guelph in Ontario did a detailed analysis and determined that all of the major gridded global temperature data sets rely exclusively or nearly exclusively on NOAA GHCN data. That's NASA, NOAA, and the Climatic Research Unit in England, the University of East Anglia. The data sets are not independent. They all use the same data. They all use approximately the same methods. It's not surprising they come up with the same answer. Okay, now here I'm going to start getting where we really run into problems. We were used to seeing maps like the one on the left from NOAA all covered with red, the Earth's burning up, a few small blue areas where the Earth is cool. But if we look, and in December they showed record heat in Central Africa. But if we look at their other map, which shows where their actual thermometers are located, they don't actually have any data in Central Africa. Those record heat was generated by computer models. In fact, they don't have any thermometers on about half of the Earth's surface. So much of this red area you're seeing is fabricated, and a lot of the record heat is fabricated too. So what was actually going on in Central Africa in December? Well, satellites cover the Earth very completely except for some small areas near the poles, and they show that temperatures in Central Africa in December were very close to normal. There was no record heat. The NOAA computer models are simply flawed. And some more work from Ross McKittrick shows what some of the major problems are with the NOAA temperature data. NOAA has been losing GHCN is the Global Historical Climatology Network from NOAA. They've been losing stations at a very rapid rate. In fact, they've lost nearly 80% of their stations since the 1980s. That's the graph on the left. The graph on the right is even more troubling. The average latitude of their stations has dropped 8 degrees closer to the equator since the 1880s, which produces a spurious warming trend. Temperatures increase about 1 degree centigrade for each degree you move closer to the equator. So that theoretically this would produce 8 degrees warming just because they're losing stations in the north relative to stations in the south. This is a huge problem. Another huge problem with the data is I've plotted on here the 2001 version of the NASA temperature graph and the current version below it. Notice the blue error bars on there. Those are their 95% confidence intervals. They're altering their data far outside of their confidence intervals. With something you just don't do in science, it means that their confidence intervals are meaningless if they can change them, outside of that range. Okay, so now this gets into the controversy which Senator Erickson was referring to at the beginning. A few years ago, the last Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change The post-2000 global warming pause was central to the IPCC report. It was, everyone accepted it. What their concern was that they wanted to explain it, why it didn't interfere with their theory. Last February, Michael Mann, probably the best known climate alarmist in the world, published a paper where he said, yes, the global warming pause is real. The evidence here contradicts claims that it wasn't real. So this was 1 year ago he presented this. But suddenly, in the middle of last year, right before the Paris Climate Summit, suddenly NASA and NOAA declared, no, there never was a pause, it wasn't real. It's a huge turnaround, and that's what the that's what the controversy was that Senator Erickson was referring to. It's that one of NOAA's two principal scientists at Asheville, where the National Climatic Data Center is located, said that Tom Carl broke many rules, lost data. Data was changed to make the sea appear warmer. They played fast and loose with the figures, a blatant attempt to intensify the paper's impact. Apparently the data is reproducible. All of the work was irreproducible. All of the work that was done on it was kept on one computer, which apparently broke. And it's just inconceivable that you're doing work which affects trillions of dollars worth of economics, and you would keep it all on one computer and lose it. From the world I come from, that's just inconceivable that things like that would occur. Okay, now I'm going to get more into the United States temperature. But this shows another huge problem. This is from Ross McKittrick's paper, 2010 paper. In 1900, almost all of the temperature stations in Earth were located in the United States. There was also a fair amount in Japan or parts of Australia, but the global temperature record was largely determined by what was going on in the United States at that time. Tom Carl, the person at the center of the current controversy at NOAA, wrote a paper in 1980 saying that there had been no evidence of, 1989, that there was no evidence of warming in the United States from 1895 to 1997. This was reported in the New York Times. Okay, now I'm going to show you what's going on with the U.S. temperature record. The blue line is the actual measured NOAA, USHCN, United States Historical Climatology Network temperatures. This is the average of all of the stations. They show that the 1930s was the warmest decade, and there's been a general cooling trend in the United States since the 1930s. But the red line is their adjusted data. They take the data and they alter it. And they create the warming trend, which we always see in the graphs, is because they've altered their raw data. People assume it's coming from the thermometers, but it's not. The graph on the right shows the hockey stick of alterations that are made to the temperature. They've increased warming by 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit by altering the data. The next graph is another hockey stick on the left. This one is fabricated data. As I mentioned earlier, they're losing a lot of temperature data recently. What this shows is the percentage of data which is modeled rather than measured every month. At this point, more than 40% of the NOAA U.S. temperature data does not actually come from thermometers. It comes from computer models. And the graph on the right is the one that's most disturbing of all to me. It's a graph of adjustments versus atmospheric CO2. And it shows almost a perfect correlation, an R-squared of 0.98. This indicates confirmation bias. They are adjusting the data to match their theory. Okay, people generally believe that the United States is getting hotter, that summers are getting hotter. The graph on the right is from the EPA website, which incidentally has not been taken down as people have claimed. And what it shows is that the 1930 heat waves were much worse in the 1930s than anything now, and that there's really been no change in heat waves in the United States since the 1890s. They're essentially the same as they are now. Okay, during 1988, James Hansen appeared before Congress, and it was a very hot summer. It was the last very hot summer we've had in the United States. And him and Senator Tim Wirth sabotaged the air conditioning in that room that day. He sat there and perspired. dabbed his brow, and he predicted hot summers for the United States, a lot more hot summers for the United States. The exact opposite has happened. Summers have gotten much cooler in the United States. In the 1930s, we had temperatures of 110 degrees, 113 degrees in the upper Midwest and Wisconsin. Now they rarely get over 90. We had a huge heat waves in 1950s. We had a big heat wave in 1980, a big heat wave in 1988, but none since. The frequency of hot days has declined rather sharply in the United States since the 1930s. Okay, here's one of local interest. If you remember in 2010 when they had the Winter Olympics in Vancouver, everyone was saying it was very warm. It was an El Nino year. The snow was very bad that year. People said that we're sure that it was the end of the Winter Olympics. But since then, temperatures, the plot on the right is January temperatures in Washington State. Since that Olympics, temperatures here have plummeted, and as you're probably aware, this past January was the coldest January in Washington State since 1979, and temperatures have dropped rather sharply in January over the last decade. Snow cover. These graphs show snow cover in the Northern Hemisphere from Rutgers University Global Snow Lab. Both fall and winter snow cover has increased substantially in the Northern Hemisphere. What this means is that the snow line is pushing further south. Arctic air is penetrating further south, and we're seeing snow in places like the Deep South in Mississippi and Alabama, where we didn't used to see snow. It's because of cold air mixing further south and bringing the snow line further south. Okay, so now I'm just going to get into a few more general things. This is a very interesting article from 1871. Sort of ridiculing people about climate change. People have always believed the climate's changing, and the title of this article is Imaginary Changes of Climate. It says, every season is sure to be extraordinary, almost every month, one of the driest, wettest, windiest, coldest, or hottest ever known. Much observation, which ought to correct a tendency to exaggerate, seems in some minds to have rather a tendency to increase it. And that's exactly what we're seeing now. This is another of my favorite articles from the Monthly Weather Review from 1907. Is not honesty the wisest policy? The misuse of meteorological data is a crime against the community. It is up to the independent press to repress all climate cheats and hoaxes. That's people like me, bloggers. Okay, in 1922, the Monthly Weather Review reported from the U.S. consul in Norway a radical change in Arctic conditions and hitherto unheard of high temperatures in the Arctic. It said glaciers were disappearing. It said last winter the ocean did not freeze over even on the north coast of Spitsbergen. The map on the left shows that there is currently ice there. So there's more ice in the eastern Arctic now than there was in 1922. Once again, I'm going to put this in context of the NASA temperature graph. This is the NASA land-ocean temperature graph. Less ice when it was cold in 1922 and more ice, and now that it's much warmer now. The graph doesn't seem to make sense. Okay, currently the map I'm showing is the thickness of Arctic ice. This is from the Danish Meteorological Institute. Currently Arctic ice is about 2 to 3 meters thick across most of the Arctic. In 1940, Arctic ice was also about 2 to 3 meters. It was about 2 meters thick in 1940. This was reported by a very famous Soviet expedition. They spent 2 years in the Arctic measuring the ice, and they talked about how it had decreased since the beginning of the century. Now, this is a very important article from the New York Times from 1958. It says, although the idea that a solid ice sheet covers the central Arctic has lingered stubbornly in the popular fancy, the northern cap of ice worn by our planet is actually a thin crust on the whole, only about 7 feet thick, 2 meters over an ocean 2 miles deep. So the Arctic ice was the same thickness in 1958 as it is now. And the belief, people still have this belief that the Arctic ice used to be very thick, and this clearly states that that was not the case. It's always been a thin sheet which comes and goes in summer and winter. Okay, this is a graph put out by Carl Mears from Remote Sensing Systems. He is not a climate skeptic. He's more of an alarmist. But he shows how troposphere temperatures have not warmed and models have failed. The yellow bands are what the model predictions are. The blue band is what measured troposphere temperatures are. It shows that climate models show warming when none has occurred over the last 20 years. Okay, now getting back to my first point about okay, so NASA generated these graphs. They must know what they're doing. They went to the moon. But if you look at the actual people who went to the moon, this was Senator Harrison Schmitt, who was my senator in New Mexico. He was the only scientist who've ever walked on the moon, and he's a prominent climate skeptic. So we have a 100% consensus of climate skeptics who are moonwalkers. A few years ago, 49 of NASA's top people from the Apollo program, scientists, engineers, administrators, and astronauts, sent a letter to the NASA administrator disputing their climate research. So the people who went to the moon, the people who are actually involved in going to the moon, are not part of the current NASA climate effort, and the people who aren't part of the NASA climate effort did not go to the moon. And it's not just the temperature data that's been altered. Sea level, this graph shows sea level data in 1982 was NASA sea level data, once again published by James Hansen, their #1 climate alarmist. It showed that sea level tailed off after 1950 and barely rose anymore. The current NASA graphs show an increase in the rate of sea level rise after 1950. Once again, the data has been altered. In 1963, the very alarmist English newspaper The Guardian reported the same thing, that the sea level had slowed down after 1940, which is the opposite of what NASA graphs show now. People have been blaming other people for climate change in Australia for 170 years. This is an 1846 article. Great changes have taken place in the climate of Australia. Everyone agrees. The Aborigines say that this climate has undergone these changes since white men came in the country. This is something that's been going on forever. Okay, so who are the people behind the climate alarmism? This is Paul Ehrlich. He's a very close associate of John Holdren, who was President Obama's science czar. In 1997, Paul Ehrlich went to Australia to condemn their stand on greenhouse gases. He said it was criminal and would cause extreme weather. The same Paul Ehrlich in 1970 said the oceans would be dead and America would run out of food and water by 1980. In 1969, the same Paul Ehrlich, who once again was John Holdren's close associate, Obama's science advisor, he proposed poisoning Africans to solve environmental problems. In 1990, he also said we needed to get rid of the rich people. In 1988, NASA's top climate expert, James Hansen, predicted that lower Manhattan would be underwater between 2008 and 2018. He said the West Side Highway will be underwater. There will be tape across the windows because of high winds, and the birds won't be there. Okay, the actual tide gauge in Manhattan shows no change in net change in sea level over the last 20 years. He was completely wrong. In 1969, the New York Times predicted an ice-free Arctic and catastrophic shifts in climate within a generation. 3 days later, they predicted a new ice age. In 1989, the top UN climate experts said we only had until the year 2000 to stop global warming before flooding and crop failures caused an exodus of eco-refugees. Obviously, that didn't happen. In 2004, the UK government's chief scientist said global warming would force us all to move to Antarctica. This is ridiculous. The temperatures in Antarctica are unlivably cold. In 2012, the UK Environment Secretary predicted permanent drought for the UK. 3 weeks later, they were having flooding, and it's been wet ever since. In 2009, the Bureau of Meteorology in Australia's head of climate analysis predicted a permanent drought for Southeast Australia. Obviously, that didn't happen. I was just in Australia. It was very green down there. So conclusions, climate data is being grossly mishandled, as Senator Erickson pointed out. Climate data has been massively altered. Improper procedures have been used. Climate predictions have consistently failed. Climate models have shown no skill. Some of the academics promoting global warming are of very questionable character, and there is no legitimate evidence that the U.S. has warmed since the 1930s. Thank you.
I get my microphone on. Mr. Heller, thank you very much for running through that very interesting factual presentation that you put together. You've obviously done a lot of work on it. We have some members here that are going to have an insurrection if they don't get you ask you questions.
Okay.
So we certainly are going to have a time period here for some questions that are, I hope will be very respectful. Senator Ranker, would you like to go first? And we're going to have 10 minutes for questions, if that would suffice.
I'll be quick. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you.
And let's keep it in the form of questions.
I have a question. So I feel like the only ones still debating climate science are this legislature and Congress. I feel like some of this presentation may be alternative facts. That is several dozen peer-reviewed papers by hundreds of scientists that are all directly contrary to your entire testimony. How do you explain that?
Exactly which parts of my testimony do you feel it's contrary to?
This says climate change is real, it is human caused, it's undebatable, and it is dozens of scientists, hundreds of scientists and dozens of peer-reviewed papers by people who have their degrees in climate science.
Okay, so first of all, the stuff which I presented this morning is work which has been done by very small groups of people within NASA and NOAA. And as I mentioned up front, that the work which you're referring to depends on the accuracy of that data. If the underlying temperature data is incorrect, it severely affects their conclusions, and it also affects the conclusions of policymakers. That's why it's very important that we get down to this, and that's why what Senator Erickson mentioned at the beginning up front is very accurate. I'm a geologist. I'm well aware that the climate changes. In 1975, the National Academy of Sciences report said the climates of the Earth have always been changing. How much and how fast, we do not know. 20,000 years ago, Chicago was under a mile of ice. 1930s, it was so hot in the Midwest, people had to move out. The climate does change. It changes all the time. There's no question that carbon dioxide impacts the radiative balance of the atmosphere. I have worked personally on software development of National Center for Atmospheric Research's radiative transfer model. I'm very versed in this. I understand that more carbon dioxide increases temperature somewhat. What is being debated is how much. Is it serious? Is it a problem? I think it's a straw man argument to say you either believe in climate science or you don't. That's not what's going on here. I would agree with your 97% consensus. What I disagree with is the amount. I disagree with the way the temperature data has been handled.
Great. Senator Honeyford, you had a question? And then we'll go to Senator Carlisle.
Just a very short question. They've cranked up the email chain, and so I'm getting all kinds of emails opposed to your testifying here. Several of them say it's a massive waste of taxpayer dollars. Can you tell me how many dollars the state has given you to appear here?
Zero.
Thank you.
Thank you for that clarifying that. Yes, Senator Carlisle?
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. My question goes to sort of the linkage of credibility. You basically cited at least 7 times or so the New York Times as a source of important information, and then a couple days ago or so you tweeted, the New York Times is fake news. You won't find much truth there. So I'm struck by that inconsistency.
Yeah,
that's my first question.
Right. I think that the New York Times has recently gone downhill quite a bit, unfortunately. I grew up in a house where we had the New York Times delivered every single day. I read the New York Times every single day when Nixon was traveling to China. I took it as gospel truth back then. I think that they used to have very accurate information. And basically the articles I referred to were basically quotes from scientists. So regardless of whatever their editorial opinions are now, I think that their information they were presenting from scientists actually, and I remember the 1970s quite well. I believe that they accurately did represent the state of what scientists were saying at that time.
And then my second question is, yesterday after touring the state Senate chamber, you took a nice photo and tweeted it out. And then one of your very related tweets was the entire quote, your tweet yesterday, the entire white liberal progressive collective intellect consists of nothing but hatred, insults, and lies.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious what the association is with the Washington State Senate with that comment.
I'm not certain what I was referring to. Probably just that it's a fairly liberal state. But I was at the Women's March in D.C. Last week.
We'll have to ask you to put that banner down and sit down.
You've wasted enough time. You should be
Thank you.
talking about solutions to
Thank you.
climate change.
Thank you.
The science is settled. It's a waste of time. It's an insult
Please don't,
to people in this state that you let people like him have a platform.
Thank you, sir.
And then,
Always exciting.
and then appreciating that comment. I just want to, if I could, Mr. Chair, I just want to apologize on behalf of the Washington State Legislature to the 7 million people of Washington State that our Republican majority has chosen to prioritize this effort. Thank you.
I want to ask Senator Erickson, are you still on the line? Senator Erickson? I guess not. So I wanted to ask if he had a question. Does anyone else on the committee have a question? Senator Hobbs or no? All right. Okay. Well, Mr. Heller, I want to thank you very much for coming forward, and I apologize for that outburst that we had there from that individual. But I also want to say that I really appreciate the presentation, the quick pace that you had. I'm going to hang on to this and read through some of the articles a little bit more completely. So I want to thank you very much for taking time to visit us here at the Washington State Legislature today, and sure appreciate your work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator.
All right. Okay, we've got a